Re leboga thata mme Winnie Madikizela. You are my role model, a strong woman, a leader, a helper, a mother to our nation.
Dear Lillian Goy, what you did gave us free and rights.
Na myang influencer mo pelong ba ke me Ekna Moliwa.
Dear women of yesterday, I may not know your names, but I appreciate the big step you took to fight for women's rights. Because of your actions, women's voices are heard.
Ekna Moliwa ine ile mo o analing kutlwelo botlhoko mo batšheng. O ne a re rotloetsa gore re tsene sekolo.
Ke mo khethile ka ke strong woman. Ke example ya gore re le di young women tshwantse re phele bjang, tshwantse o sa ditlogella o nne strong, o kgone tikemella le ka osana. Le di example dilo tse pila tse di rileng ba di bona ko ene. She was a fighter.
Na ke khethile mme Lillian Goy because always the rights tsa basadi ba botlhe ba South Africa ba race yotlhe gore ba botlhe ba tshwane ba lekane.
Basadi ba kgale ba tlile karolo e kgolo mo matshelong a rena, cause ba kgonne go ya kwa ba matšhe go lwela ditokelo tsa rena basadi, and then ba kgonne go re lwela gore like mosadi a tswe botho ba hae a sa nna ko tlasa moruti wa monna.
Many women took part in fighting for women's rights, but as young people nowadays, a re lebelle batho ba ileng hore ha ba mentioniwe on the history. We do not get chance to know their names and appreciate them.
Mosebetsi wa gae o tlo o tswela pele.
The political situation was not easy for women then, but now women are even able to be part of the parliament. Their voices now are heard.
Rena re le basha re nyako itsweletsa pele, and then re khona bona gore le ba batlang go mora wa rena le bona ba khona tswela pele.
That's why ke re ke nyako nna fighter ka how le fighter you will never give up in life. Nthe o inyakang o tla ifitlhella.
I love you for what you have done. Thank you.
Ngiyakuthandza kakhulu. Ngibhale njalo.
Thank you. Welcome to this conversation that we are having. Those young women are reflecting on the leadership that has been provided by a generation that came before them. Some of these women, they never got to meet, but the legacy of those women is still there. These young women are appreciating how women like Lillian Goy fought for the rights of women, for the place of women in society. For you and me to be sitting here today having this conversation, women made it possible. And we are trying to do the same. We are trying to make sure that the generation that will come after us finds a space that is enabling, finds a space that allows them to speak their truth, to amplify their voice, because they do have a voice. They just need a platform for that voice to be heard and amplified. So this is why we are having these conversations. We want to create an enabling space to say to young women, to say to women in general, your voice is valid, your voice counts, and we need to hear that voice. We want to unmute that voice because women's voices have been unmuted for a long time. So I have the pleasure of welcoming Me N. Shongwe Gituku. Is it how we say your surname, Gituku?
Well, it depends on the day. I mean, the official pronunciation is Githuku.
Githuku, okay. Is it a Ugandan surname?
It's Kenyan.
Kenyan, okay. Asante. Asante is thank you.
Karibu. Yes.
Karibu.
Thanks.
The little I know, Karibu is welcome, right?
Yes. So you know your name. If I look at your name, if I put on my Kenyan hat, I will call you Fina.
Yes, that's how I say it.
It is. Is this Fina?
Yes,
really?
This is Fina.
Okay.
Fina.
Mine.
You're going to find.
You pronounce it in English. So Githuku.
Githuku. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and say hello to the young women, the women in all parts of South Africa who are joining this conversation in your own special way, and just tell us a bit more about yourself.
Good afternoon to women of power everywhere. I listened to the young women who were, sharing their stories of hope from previous women leaders. And I just want to just say that it is such an opportunity to have a woman that you look up to. And that for me, as I look at my own life and my own leadership journey, there have been so many women, beginning with my own mother, who have been my role models. And so I love that the story is about role models that you have and that you're looking up to, because then you can never ever say it can't be done. So, the hashtag Let Freedom Reign is a powerful one that Soul City has put on the table. And I really think that freedom will come from knowing and recognizing that there are women who have overcome what each and every one of us desires to overcome, or that needs to overcome, and that you're not the first one in the place where you are. As horrible or as difficult or as challenging as your situation may be, there is always one who has been there before and who has overcome it. And so this has to be a story and a conversation about what it would take for each and every one of us to overcome, because the women who've gone before us have done that and can show us the way.
Wow, powerful, powerful. Thank you for that powerful introduction. And you are right, women have role models out there. They just need to start looking at their homes. Their own mothers are the role models, that they have. And a lot of time, young women want to look externally, to look at a celebrity, to look at someone they consider powerful, without acknowledging that the role that the mother plays in the house is that of a leader. Women who are selling tomatoes, magwinyas, and other things, doing jobs that people look down on, just so that they can put bread on the table and educate their children. And for me, those are the heroes we should be celebrating. Those are the women we should be putting on the map. Absolutely. So if my own daughter one day is asked who's your role model and she doesn't mention me, I would feel like I have not done a good job.
Oh my goodness, yes. I had the chance
to make it to at least her list.
I had a very emotional moment about 2 weeks ago. I was visiting the school that I went to, undergraduate school in New York State. It's like upstate New York State, near the Canadian border. And I hadn't been there for 34 years. I had not been there. It's very far, so you have to go there. You can't just stop by, And I was walking through this place and I was trying to imagine how I got so far from Kenya, And I remember how my mother had kind of, had said to me, listen, if it means you go to the end of the world so that you can break through the world, so that you can have a successful life, we will make you do it. And I said to me, how are we going to be able to do this with dollars? And she says, don't worry. That's my problem to sort. Your problem is to do school and do it well. Yeah. So just go do school, do it well. You know what my mother was doing? In addition to running a business, she had a regular business, which was like wholesale food stuff, a little bit like what Unilever does, like supermarkets do, but she was doing it for wholesale. Is that she used to go to abattoirs and find gallstones from the abattoirs, because she found out that there were companies in Switzerland and France that were importing gallstones to be able to use them in pharmaceuticals or something, or for lab tests or something. And so she was exporting that, and then that foreign currency would be sent to me to be able to pay my school fees. And she would go to imagine going to hang out in abattoirs all over the country, and she would go to Tanzania and all of that, looking and hunting for that. So, I mean, that has to be a role model. You'll go to the end of the world to figure out what to do so that your child has a future, and one that she knows she can rest knowing that she's taken care of.
Yeah. And what a pity that, the world still sees women as subjugate, as subordinate to men. We are still subjugated, still under, in some societies even, women are still literally under the leadership and the authority of men. They are not allowed space to be their own heads and their own leaders. And I think our generation is a generation that is pushing back on that. And hopefully the baton will be passed on to the next generation to say, we are now women leaders. We don't need a man to lead us. We don't need a man to create space for us. We can create our own spaces. So thank you for joining this conversation. Before we get to your role in the UN and the UN, I think I want, for a young woman who's sitting at home looking at two of us, who's saying, but is it possible for me? Will I ever make it? Because sometimes when you are born in poverty, when your education is dependent on how much your parents have. You mentioned in New York, you mentioned being in overseas. I had the opportunity to also get a scholarship and get international qualification. But is there opportunity for somebody who's sitting in rural KZN, a young woman whose dream is, she can only dream as far as KZN is as big as KZN is. She doesn't see opportunity to go beyond the borders because maybe she lives in a world that says to her it's not possible. Mm-hmm. So I want you to say to that young woman, why do you think it's possible for any young woman to be where you and I are sitting right now?
Mm. It's a difficult question because I cannot pretend to have grown up in a context that is poor. I mean, I grew up, in a very comfortable space. My father was a government civil servant, so we weren't rich, but we were certainly comfortable. So I do this really recognizing that I cannot pretend to step into somebody else's shoes. But I did some work with young people in South Africa and Kenya before I joined the UN. And, I was an entrepreneur myself. And I had a particular set of exercises that I used to do working with high school kids. And we used to go to Tibets and equivalent to have conversations with them. And one of the big issues that happened at that time, the conversations I had with women, some of these young women were in grade 11 and grade 12, and it was the early part of their matric year. And I was asking them, what would you like to do beyond your matric? And it was very interesting because most of them answered and said, I'm going to help my aunt in the spaza shop, or I'm going to, sell some, whatever it is they were imagining was within the square mile around them, literally like down the road, right? So this is their thinking. But a lot of it was about my aunt, my father, some elder relative has defined what it is they're going to do. So I asked them to write this on a piece of paper. So they wrote it on a piece of paper. And then I asked them to flip it, right? And I just said, close your eyes for a minute. And if there's any young people here right now, just close your eyes for a minute, Just close your eyes and say to yourself, if I didn't have to do what my aunt, my uncle, my older brother, older cousin, or anybody who is defining what I do with my life, if I didn't have to think about them right now, and I could do anything that I want to do, if I could just dream to be anyone that I wanted to dream to be, what would that be? And I, kind of gave them time to think through it, and then they wrote it down. Pina, I cannot lie to you. This was for me one of the most powerful exercises I have ever had in my life. Because when we flipped those papers, these young women were saying, and men, there were young boys as well, and they were basically saying, I want to go to the moon and be one of the like the first Black woman astronaut. Another one says that I want to create a time machine that will reverse HIV so that my parents would not have passed away, and I would be able to have the life and education that I wish I could. But the same for all the people around me, that with that time machine, we can create a different kind of future because we reverse all the problems that we've had in the past. Another one talked about being the creator of the HIV vaccine. I mean, this is about 10 or 12 years ago. And so one after the other was sharing dreams that they've never had the permission to imagine. And so the biggest, and for me, the most powerful tool of all is that you have to be able to imagine something outside and beyond where you are. Because if you cannot, then your world is immediately limited to the world that you can imagine. And so it is one thing that we can do as leaders, or those who are in situations of privilege, is to be able to really help those around us to dream and imagine a world beyond that which is defined for them. Because only then would you have the hunger to make sure that you succeed where you are. And, one of the things that strikes me, and I go back to that university where I went, we were 60 Black students out of 2,000 students. Every one of the Black students, especially from the US, African Americans at that school, were from backgrounds who were never expected to make it. They were from very poor families. They were from families who were ridden with drugs, who had never known their father, whose mother barely eked out a living, selling stuff either illegally or maybe doing domestic work. So there just was no promise for them. But the one thing that they did was that they decided, I'm going to get out of this. And I have a different dream from the dream that is around me. And they would actually somehow manage to put a dream in their own minds that gave them the power to then do well with school and break out, whether it's through sports or through academics. They broke out and they went into this school. And today, some of them, one of them is a Supreme Court judge, another one is a professor, and these are people whose lives were stuck. If we looked at the original playbook, this was going to be their life. They were stuck in poverty forever. So, I do it with humility, knowing that that's not my story, but I have seen that story play out in people's lives. But the biggest issue was having a vision bigger than the life around you promises.
Yeah, and knowing that dream is valid, having someone confirm and affirm that dream is valid, and you can actually actualize it. Absolutely. With the right kind of support, right attitude, right mind, set of mind, attitude and mind. So I think it's important, and to all the young women who are listening, even the young men who are listening, those dreams should not just end as dreams. We do need people who will create, apps that will help us do things that we are not able to do today. We need people who will, with this globalization that we have, take advantage of the networks that are being created between the different countries and bring us something that will change the world, because change is something that we need. And who's to say it can't be you who was born in rural Eastern Cape? Who's to say it can't be you who sleeps at night every day eating pap and cabbage? Because those dreams just need you to say, I'm going to get whatever that I'm putting in my mind, I will realize. And there is support, there is help. And I'm sure when we talk about, programs like the Generation Equality, that's when we will show young people what the possibilities are that are out there. The narrative that it's only young white people who make it, for me, is not. There is truth to it, but it's something that we need to change. We need to say to our young people, you can start now being an entrepreneur. You don't have to wait when you finish school. Even as someone who goes to school, if your gift, your talent is baking, bake those cakes and go and sell them to your classmates.
Exactly.
Don't wait. Exactly. Don't wait to finish matric, because the way our minds are trained, like life is phases. You must do school. Only when you finish, start thinking about the future. The future starts now, from a young age, and that's what we try to instill in the Soul Buddies clubs, in the Rise clubs. That's the mentality we are trying to instill in young people, to say we can create our own world. We can be the change that we want to see. And I want to talk about, the instruments that have been ratified, because they are there to help us as women to be free, as we are saying, let freedom reign. But we are not free. Even with those ratified instruments, we have the CEDAW, and I hope you will unpack it a bit for us. We have the Maputo Protocol. These are meant to make life easy for those who are discriminated against. But life is not easy for the LGBTI community, for women. We see that more and more women get violated. It's like the more there's policy that tries to restrict violation, the more violation happens. More and more, when the law is tightened, the more the violation happens. So can you please unpack for us? There's a disturbing sound. I'm not sure where it's coming from. Let's hope we find it and we resolve that one. But can you unpack for us CEDAW and how it was meant to help us fight discrimination or eliminate discrimination, and how CEDAW can actually be translated on the ground? How can we make it reality on the ground?
Okay, thank you so much. CEDAW stands for the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And this is a convention that for the United Nations, and you remember, let me start out by saying that the United Nations is not an organization that sits in a nice office. The United Nations are member states. So when I say the United Nations, I'm talking about countries, about South Africa, about Lesotho, Eswatini. I'm talking about, Bosnia and, Peru and Brazil and, India and all these countries who are members. They're the ones who are the United Nations. So that convention is a convention that was put on the table by nations. And I think what is important to make it relevant is that in countries we have discriminatory laws that and let me just say one thing, Pina, which is is quite sad news, and that is that there is no country in the world where there is no discrimination. So there's no country in the world that has full non-discriminatory laws yet, right? So in every country in the world, women and girls will have some form of discrimination. We have made significant progress in terms of reducing the amount of discriminatory laws that are on the table, right? So I think the first thing to say about the convention, but also about discriminatory laws, and this is something that as UN Women and World Bank and several organizations have been tracking the issue of discriminatory laws. What is the most important is that first and foremost, we remove the discriminatory law so that you have access to legal protection as a result of it. So it exists. Whether you can actually realize it is a second issue, and I think this is what you're referring to. So in a study that we've done, what we found is that South Africa is at about 88% of our laws that are non-discriminatory. Where the law still remains discriminatory is where, in particular, the law is contradictory with customary law. So for instance, you have you have legal age of consent for sex at, say, 16, I believe. But then you have customary law or customary practice that allows an older man to take a young girl as a wife, and we found this a lot during COVID, where parents who were in desperate situation were in some instances trading a 14-year-old girl or 15-year-old girl in exchange for money to a man who would like to have her as a wife or as a partner or whatever, right? So right there's discrimination, because the sort of traditional practice encourages or allows or does not exclude a man from taking on a younger girl as his wife, but the law itself has this statement, but it contradicts, right? So this is one of the biggest issues for us, is that you've got laws, but the practice is something else. Let's look at land. In the and if you look at the convention, land access to land and the rights to land is very, very important. And so if you look at the issue of land, is that every South African has the right to land. It's in the Constitution, so in principle, everybody has access to land. But in certain cultures, the king or the traditional leader in that community has the last word in terms of who accesses the land. In some instances, and I'll give Eswatini as an example. When I got married, my husband is from Eswatini. When I got married, I immediately became a legal minor because of marrying under the then Roman Dutch law and the Swazi law and practice and law at the time. So I had more power the day before I got married than the day after I got married. And what that also meant is that, number one, I can't own any property without my husband's clearance. But on top of that, if I say, in the unfortunate case of my husband being deceased and I wanted land, I could not access land unless the local chief has decided that I am worthy of that land. But he would only do that if I had a son. If I had only daughters, then I have no right to land. And this is not what is written in the law. This is what is practiced. So the truth of it is that the law exists, but the practice is different. And a simple example is also just trying to get a bank loan for a house. You want to try and get a bank loan for a house or for a car, and you find that the law allows you to get the loan, but the banker believes that because you're married, you have to bring your husband along. And I have had many, many, many arguments with the banks who keep insisting that my husband has to come and sign along with me. And I'm like, okay, fine. He is my husband. And in this particular instance, we might own the property together. But actually, I have the right to do this on my own. And so the practice is what creates a big problem. So we may have removed many discriminatory laws, but we have a different practice because of the sort of cultural norms and beliefs that perpetuate the discrimination. And so in this convention, it is something for us that is so important. And we have a project on discriminatory laws. We work very closely with different organizations of human rights, to make sure that this is an issue that is dealt with and that we get to the bottom of it. And I'll just give you an example of a project that we've been doing across Africa that is very, very important. We call it the Kotla. And the Kotla is the Council of Traditional Leaders in Africa. And we decided that if we're going to change the game in terms of this discriminatory laws and practice, that what we need to do is to work with the holders of culture, those who hold and influence and define culture, right? So in many of our countries, it's traditional and religious leaders. And so we brought traditional religious leaders and we said to them, for instance, one of the problems we have is child marriage, or what is called child marriage, is taking on young girls before their time. And this is what translates so easily into the kind of sex trafficking of young girls and really sexual abuse, the intergenerational violence is one that is very much sort of housed in this original culture of young girls as brides. And so working with the traditional leaders, they have gone, and we have an example in Malawi where 30,000 marriages have been annulled because they are now considered against the law. But it took the chiefs to participate in that, where they would literally walk in their village and one by one annul marriages. Take this girl, put her back in school. Take this girl, put her back in school. But you have to have a school that's willing to take back a girl who's been a mother, right? So there's multiple discriminatory laws then that you have to deal with, but they start with having the will and the leadership of those who are the holders of culture to start changing the game there. And so we've had reversals by Islamic leaders of child marriage, female genital mutilation. I mean, ukutwala is one of the big things that we have to deal with here in South Africa. So it takes working with traditional leaders and with religious leaders to start changing that story, because everyone thinks they decide. They decide if I own this land or I don't own this land, right? So that's a big piece of work around this.
Sure. What you've just unpacked is structural patriarchy in its totality. And I think if people didn't know what structural patriarchy is, we've just unpacked it so well, and in how women remain discriminated, oppressed, and whatever effort that you make, if you live in a community where traditional leadership, does not take the rights of women into consideration, you will forever remain subjugated. You will never have a day where, as a woman, you really get to enjoy your full rights. And I think Mpomo Happy is alluding to that, and he's asking, how are customary laws related to the Constitution? Is the Constitution the supreme law of the country, or do we still have the customary law overriding your constitutional right in some communities?
Well, I mean, the Constitution is the law. But what I'm saying to you, Mpo, and this is what we found not just in South Africa. We found this in all the 25 years since Beijing. We did a study in every single country. And what we found is left behind is that we may have discriminatory laws that have been removed, but the practice, and you see the big thing with these issues is accountability. Who's tracking that? Who's checking to make sure that in every single village or community or traditional chief is making sure that in that community the practice is different. So it is not that customary law is above it, is that the practice is where it plays out. And this in your own household. At a household level, you will find decisions being made about who goes to school, decisions being made about, who can work and how much people get paid. So it's not that the law says this, but this is what the practice is. And this is my point about customary law and the importance of bringing in those who influence practice of the law. So just before I came on, I was talking to Power FM about the gender pay gap, right? So the law of South Africa and the Employment Equity Act requires non-discrimination in the world of work in terms of pay, in terms of type of work, and so on. But what is the practice? The practice is that women in general sit in lower paying jobs. The practice is that when you get when you apply for a job, HR asks you for your previous salary slip. And if your previous salary slip was in a job that was already discriminated against because it was in a kind of job structure that was set aside for women in a sort of administrative jobs, rather than in a higher technical or managerial job, and then you go into a managerial job, they will use your history to determine your future rather than look at the value of the specific job. So it's not so much that customary law is above the Constitution, but it is that the practice of institutions that determine women's lives, whether in the world of work or at the community level or even in their church or in their schools, those will be translated, will be interpreted based on what people's beliefs are rather than what the Constitution itself says, unless it's being policed. And that's why obviously this becomes a big issue. And I know right now the DG of the Department of Women has been rallying women lawyers from all over the country to run programs on radio to educate women about what their rights are, because women don't even know what their rights are to know what they can claim, right? And so information is a big gap in this whole story of ensuring that discrimination is not perpetuated.
Yeah. And I think that's where organizations like Soul City have a niche.
Yeah.
We can, and we have been doing it, but we can intensify the work we do in creating awareness about the rights of women, creating awareness about what discrimination looks like. Because if people don't know that these practices are discriminatory, Shanga is giving an example of farm workers, who are not compensated well, who are discriminated in how they are compensated for the work that they do on the farms. Even when we have progressive law and labor laws in our country, it doesn't reach everyone. Not everybody, as you say, the practice still discriminates, even when the law says it cannot be done in that way. So how do we then take, UN agencies and other organizations' roles in making sure that on the ground we start to dismantle these practices? Because if the law provides, instruments that we can use, but we are not able to help a woman in Tuba, a woman in KZN, what is the point then of having these instruments? How do we take them out of, agencies and put them on the ground? What are the practical things we can start doing? I know we already said we can create awareness, but over and above, what else can we do to make sure that practically women access their rights?
Well, I mean, I think, some of the things that we have done has been to look specifically at specific laws and then say, how do we make sure that we break this down? So let me give you an example. On the issue of land, and land is a big one. When there was the whole discussion about land expropriation without compensation, right? And also the president's panel that was looking at land rights. We had a meeting of many women who are in the agricultural sector, with the South African Women in Dialogue, with South African Women in Farming, multiple organizations where we sat together and looked at the law specifically and looked at what the implications of the law are on women's lives and what needs to be changed to be able to actually recognize women. And then working with these organizations to start socializing those land rights. And I think this point about the radio shows that the DG is talking about is about trying to ensure that this is structured when women are aware of not just what the law is, but where to go for help. Like, what are where are the different places? Because information gaps is one of the biggest problems for women in multiple spaces. Another one is this preferential procurement law. It's another big one for us as the UN, because the president has announced that all companies have to give 40% of their procurement to women-owned businesses, right, at all levels. And what we then find is that, companies say, oh, we don't know where the women are, we can't find the women, and the law. So we worked then with women business associations across the country to say, how do we, what is your view on this law? And so we would sit with women and start actually looking at it. The recent marriage bill, with all its controversies, again, working with the South African Women in Dialogue, we supported that and provided them with a legal mind who would sit with them and start working through what are the positions of women, what are women's views and beliefs, and how do we actually begin to translate this and reflect what are women's views and opinions of this, so that it's not a conversation that's outside of us. And they're consulting in multiple groups at the provincial level in different communities, just to make sure that the view of women is really reflected in any amendment that emerges, but also in its implementation. So, I mean, as the UN, of course, we are, custodians of these different conventions. Countries are signatories of the convention. So the recent convention on sexual harassment in the world of work, this is a convention, C190 from the ILO. It is about ending sexual harassment in the world of work, which is very prevalent. And so we have been working as the UN with NEDLAC, with women's organizations, with women business associations. There is a whole pillar, multi-stakeholder platform that have been having these dialogues about how to make sure that code of conduct that South Africa has translated for companies is implemented, and working with CEOs of companies to make sure that it's their responsibility to make sure that there's no sexual harassment in the world of work and that there are sanctions for it. So where we can go as the UN, of course, we're not implementers inside of each organization, but what we can do is make sure that we are simplifying it, we're sharing it, we're socializing it so that companies can actually implement it and come back to us. So we've got many corporates who we meet with on this issue of the sexual harassment in the world of work. And I can give you multiple ones. In some instances, we are then recalled on to, as the UN, to do our own reports on how the country is implementing one law or the other, and on CEDAW, but in particular, for instance, on violence, we have the instruments such as a special rapporteur on violence, who has visited the country and been able to take a look at how the country is responding. I think this was in 2017, how the country is responding to violence and identifies the gaps. What are the gaps? And we then work with the country to continually review whether or not, in fact, we are responding to those queries that have been raised. But ultimately, the implementation of all of this is multi-pronged, because those issues of, it's like the police. The police are trained, right? They've all done training courses on how to deal with gender violence. But you and I know that the practice is completely inconsistent from one police station to the next. And a lot of that has to do with the beliefs of those who are sitting there, right? It also has to do with whether or not, either in the leadership or the commander of a particular police station is driven and is leading that police station in active responsiveness because they believe this is their responsibility. And so there's inconsistency, and you find we did a study with a global police woman professional who came, and she did a study, and she said, my goodness, the laws are there, the training is done, but the translation of it is also the culture and practice. So this is a big issue. It is not just about the law. It is about how that's translated based on the kind of culture and beliefs by those who are implementing them. So when we work on programs such as this, we have to pay attention to that and invest in the culture practice, not just in the legal and institutional frameworks. This is why we set up this COTLA, the Council on Traditional Leaders, because we wanted those, and so what we need basically is like a council of police commander, in each one of the police stations, to have some kind of way in which we are challenging them in terms of the culture and the way in which they run their police station, rather than the fact that the law is there, protection orders are there, bail should not be granted, the law is there, but and there's been some work on amending the law, but how they translate it is what matters.
Yeah. And the law is not an end in itself. It's a means. It's a means to an end, but not an end in itself. And so I'm wondering, we can see that there is progress being made, and we appreciate the progress being made, like the 40% procurement, preferential procurement, and yesterday I was in a panel with Esther Maduleke, from Department of Women, and she was presenting on this. And the question I asked is, but how are you holding those departments in government where this 40% is supposed to come from? How are you holding them accountable if that is not done? Because I think, like you were saying, the practice is different from the intention. And we don't necessarily hold people to account. Even the reporting, when it doesn't happen, I don't know, is there an accounting mechanism that is in place so that we are able to say, this you must do, we must see this translate into action. Otherwise, then we are not moving. We can only have talk shops about how good the plan is. We congratulate each other on putting the issues on the table. Yeah. But are we holding each other accountable? Because Pillar 1 of the NSP on GBVF talks about leadership and accountability. And that's where we fail most. If we don't provide good leadership, if we don't account, it's as good as not having a plan. How do we hold each other to account?
Yeah, this is a difficult one. And I will say that on the preferential procurement one, there is a presidential task team that is led by the presidency on this. And they have been trying to track this very closely. And we've had series of meetings with ministers and DGs about this. And of course, ultimately, it's the responsibility of the Department of Women to account with DPME in terms of government preferential procurement. And so, there is a monitoring tool and mechanism that is supposed to be tracking this. But there are some discrepancies in the law that are being worked through to make sure that even the levels of the amounts, like at what point are you required to do 40% procurement? So there's still some technicalities that are being worked through. But, there are different platforms that should help to translate the policy and the guidelines to real concrete impact and targeting women. I saw a comment there about young women as well, and there is a move to make sure that young women are also benefiting. But I think the culture of accountability is one that lacks and lags a lot. And the big thing is tools. One of the things that we're doing in the UN, which I think would be, the Department of Women and DPME need to use even more closely, and I think they do to some degree, but I think even more closely, is to use what we call gender trackers. And these are trackers where it's a requirement that nothing will be funded, no budgets will go through. We use that. Uganda as a country has a certification process where no budget will go to parliament unless it is certified as being gender responsive. And no budget will be passed by parliament unless parliament has gone through an audit of that budget and accepted that it has the 30%, 40%, 50% set aside. Our trackers in the UN require women's participation in all these different programs. And I tell you, since we've had that tracker, it's changed the game, because you will not get that funding. So other UN agencies will not get the funding for a program unless it demonstrates that they have got this gender tracker in place, and that they have shown that there is 30% of that budget that is going to benefit women directly. So there are tools and instruments that can be used, and there are examples that have been used. And it is a discussion that we've been having with South Africa for quite a while. And my hope is that we will be able to translate this at the budget level in real ways. So there are tools. But again, behind everything is that beliefs and culture and attitudes that we must work on. And I think, one of the things I think is a big gap, and perhaps this is something that with your soul buddies and soul risers that you could be working on, is civic education in general. When we were kids in Kenya, we all had civics. We called it civics. And civics taught us about values and integrity, and about social issues that were important, and a little bit like life orientation. But I do think that the way that life orientation is taught and I've sort of been present in some of the life orientation. In most instances, it's a course for our test. So you've got the life orientation. I have to read this document, and I must then pass a test with it, rather than the experiential, really embracing this information. This is information that I need for my life. And so even information about this kind of information about, where are opportunities, or information about what is discrimination, or information about, what are my rights, and how do I access them? And if my rights are not met, where do I go? A lot of this is just not evident. And young people don't know about it, and there it goes. As people get older, they haven't learned about it when they were young, so they kind of don't even imbibe it when they're older. So there needs to be some real investment in civics and civic education continuously. It should become a requirement from grade 1, in the same way that I think entrepreneurship should become a requirement in education. So if you had civic education and entrepreneurship, then you're beginning to create a citizen who understands their rights and understands their responsibilities and understands their accountabilities. And it's not just about your rights, it's a lot about your responsibility, because the issue of accountability is one that, mirrors rights. So you can claim your rights, but are you going to take responsibility, and are you going to hold yourself accountable when you violate those rights? So they come together. You've got rights bearers and duty bearers, and you've got the responsibility as well. It comes hand in hand. And so I think we have, because of activism in this country, there has been such a big push for rights, and I think we've done that successfully in the gender-based violence space. But I think the issue of accountability and responsibility is one that has to now be invested in a big way.
Yeah.
If we're going to change.
You touch on the gender-based violence space, and we are still among the highest in South Africa. South Africa as a country is counted among the highest in the world. Why do you think that is the case? I mean, as you were talking, I can think of how tradition is contributing, the customary laws that we have in place, how they contribute to this, even the practice, because that's the big thing that I'm getting from our talk, is that the practice is what is not shifting. The laws are progressing, people are more knowledgeable about what their rights are, but the practice is not shifting at the same pace as our policies and our laws are progressing. So what do you think are the other contributing factors to why we still have this big scourge of gender-based violence, this big pandemic that we have in our country?
This is one of those ones where we need a glass of wine for a long conversation, because, the truth of it is that this has deep historical roots.
Yeah.
Because what's interesting, if you look at the data on sexual violence, I mean, South Africa's biggest problem is sexual violence. Domestic violence, the world leaders on domestic violence are Fiji and Papua New Guinea, believe it or not, across the world in the Pacific. But in terms of sexual violence, Lesotho, Botswana, Eswatini, South Africa are the world leaders. And I mean, we're the world leaders where the rest of the world on a graph is somewhere sort of this way, and we're like out there. It's like really dramatically far out in terms of sexual violence. And the only, for me, there's obviously a very strong historical reason, which is why I'm talking about a long conversation over a glass of wine, because in truth, the emasculation of men, and it's not to justify their behavior, but to say the historical emasculation of men has meant that, and through labor, and I mean, many years ago we did a study on why HIV was so prevalent in cross-border between Zimbabwe and South Africa. And in that study, we found that a woman cross-border trader has an average of 10 sexual encounters from the time she leaves her home to the time she returns. for capital. It's part of her contribution. It's to be able to actually do so when she gets the transport to the border, that man, she doesn't have the cash, so she exchanges it for sex. She gets to the border, she has to pay customs, and part of what happened historically in this country is that labor pools had this very unnatural environment where you had these men in this one space, away from their families, and they then came up with pools of women would be literally poured into those environments, giving them sort of carte blanche to have sex with these women, at the time purportedly to stop it from rolling out into the white communities. And so this is sort of historical. So there's quite a bit of historical evidence about how sex and sexual violence was used in terms of pacifying labor groups. But I mean, that's kind of historical. And so over time, it appears that this then becomes normalized. And because it's become normalized, it's become, a way, once you normalize something, it's in my country, in Kenya, corruption has been so normalized that people hardly know the difference between, a bribe and not, it's so normalized. So the normalization of sexual violence from history, I think, just continued over time. And there hasn't been successfully yet interventions that are specific to sexual violence, because it's not just about violence. And then I think the second one is the issue of alcohol and sexual violence, and the fact that, again, in the same sort of historical labor pools, alcohol was sort of poured into these labor pools, and you have the combination then of alcohol and the violence. And so this, for me, again, goes back to the point about beliefs and mindsets and practices that are normalized over a long period of time. And then we all become sort of desensitized to this, and the normalization, all of us become party to. So it's a long and hard story, but it's a story that, again, I go back to that point about civic education. And when I worked with these young people that I talked about having dreams, doing this dreams exercise, we did a couple of exercises with young men in these environments and asking them, and they were, TVET. So these are 14, 15, 16-year-olds who are just sort of starting to have their sexual encounters. And we had questions to them about rape and if they can identify who a rapist is. And it was very interesting because for them, a rapist is a person who attacks a woman in a
dark alley
somewhere and rapes her. And so we started asking them about their own sexual encounters. Pina, this was just unbelievable, because the young men would say to us that, young women, young girls always say no to sex. It's part of the negotiation. So you have to take it. And what you do is they cry, but you just give them a sweet or something, and it's part of the courtship. So there is a deep belief amongst these young boys that we were with, and I mean, there was a group of over 50 that we were talking to in different schools, and each one of them really believed that this is how you court, and that taking sex from a young girl is a normal thing. It is what you do and what she expects, And of course, we've read books, and I remember reading this book talking about how, you expect to be raped. You almost expect to have, sex that you have not consented to, unconsenting sex. So it's a very complex and difficult sort of history, but it is one that, unless we confront it specifically, and that we do the work on the men. And so for us, the work on men has been the most important. And we've had a program, a tavern program, working with men in taverns. We're combining the issue of alcohol with sexual violence, and working in partnership with the Justice and Peace program of the Catholic Church, ironically. But because they've got such strong community organizing, they then will have men from their community who go into taverns and facilitate conversations with men about the decisions that they're making in terms of violating women and sexual violence and so on, and start changing the laws of the tavern in terms of the hours and making sure that women are safe and making sure that every woman who comes into that tavern gets home safely. So there are ways to do it, but it requires working with the men and working on their mindsets and working on their beliefs to a point where they are actually having to, check their decisions every time they think about that, because this is what they've believed all along. So that's the kind of work at a deep community level that has to happen if we're going to change this game. And we have been talking about mapping out this country ward by ward and making sure that in every single ward, whether it's a church combined with a community policing forum, that they're actually starting to do the work and identifying what is the sort of nuanced culture in that community that is driving sexual violence in particular, and how can we change it? What kind of educating is required that's specific to that? Because now we know Lusikisiki is the highest in the country in terms of rape. It's highest, but it's not that much higher than many others. So let's not isolate Lusikisiki, but let's understand why. What's happening in Lusikisiki? What is that actual culture there that can be changed? Because it can be changed. Culture is not static. Yeah. It changes all the time. So how do we actually target it? So we can't have a bazooka approach where you just and hope that it will land on the right place. We have to be able to identify it, look at what the practices are in that particular ward, and start really investing in changing that behavior. And so we've been working with faith organizations, working with civil society organizations to try to really localize what happens in one particular community. And the NSP pillar on prevention actually has a program that they're looking at in Lusikisiki for exactly this reason.
Interesting, because we do have programs in Lusikisiki. So I think to my team listening, we need to delve deep into what is happening in that community, where we are doing some of our boys mentoring programs, our rice clubs, and soul buddies clubs. And we are almost towards the end of our time.
I'm actually running late for another one.
So before I let you go, the president made an announcement on Women's Day about a fund, that is available, commitments. I think it's now sitting at 141 million that is being availed to respond to gender-based violence. Do you believe that's enough money, given the issues that we are facing in our country? And how do we make sure that each and every cent of that money is spent on responding to the violence? What are some of the practical ways we can make sure that the money is used correctly to respond and not diverted, as we've seen in our country where things can easily be diverted to other things?
Well, the good news about that particular fund is that the the fund right now is invested in by the private sector at this point, and it's run by the private sector itself. I think Judith Lamini is the chairperson of the fund, and they have worked very hard to ensure that they've got very strict monitoring and accountability measures in there. And so there is a very strong sort of intention to make sure that there's strong accountability, and that the resources that are coming through there are going particularly to the civil society organizations who do this work and do this work effectively, but also community organizations who have been very poorly funded over time and need to have the resources done. I mean, the question of whether this is enough is, it's never enough. There is just a lot of work that needs to be done. And, if one does an overall costing, and there has been some work on looking at the overall costing, the need is in the billions. But I think what is most important is not even the number, but the fact that every sector is taking responsibility for ensuring that under its watch, violence is not prevalent, right? So if we look at the Department of Transport needs to be paying attention to the fact that, trackers have a reputation of stopping in different places at borders or truck stops, and in those areas, there could be violence in that area. I'm just using that as an example. In the tourism sector, croupiers and others have been, there's a lot of violence in some of those environments. So how do we make the responsibility for prevention of violence sit in every single sector so that it's not left to the response of the police and all of these others to catch the violence and the legal system, which is already overburdened, right? But that we are investing in prevention in a way that everybody's taking responsibility for it. And therefore, the funding for gender-based violence then has to be in every sector. So every department needs to have a clear program of gender-based violence in its department. And that program then has to be accounted for in the overall investment of what that is. And because the tourism sector works with, women who own B&Bs and guest houses and, who are catering and et cetera, that you're looking at how to ensure that there's prevention programs in these environments, that you're making sure that in the mining sector, that the mining sector takes care of that, so that it is not the responsibility of Esther Maluleke and a few people to figure this whole thing out. And we put almost too much expectation on the Department of Women to be implementing what is a national crisis. And it has to be the responsibility of everyone. And as very well from Soul City, that this is the only way that we were able to kind of break the back of HIV, even though we're still very far from being able to, deal with HIV. It was at the point where, sector by sector started taking responsibility, that we all began to own it as our problem. And I think this is where the problem is with GBV, is that it's still seen as, the shelters must sort it out, and, the Department of Women should do their bit, and, 2 NGOs here and there must do their work. No, this is every sector has it and under their watch. In fact, in my view, ministers and the DGs must be held accountable if there is a violence happening under their watch in a bed and breakfast. They must take responsibility. If it's in a mine, they must take responsibility, right? And they should do everything they can to prevent it. That, for me, is what would make the difference in this story. And I think that's what the attempt is with the National Strategic Plan and the multi-stakeholder partnership therein, is to make sure that everybody everywhere is taking this and making this their business. Yeah. You can't be pointing fingers anymore. It's not going to get us anywhere.
It's not going to get us anywhere. I totally agree. All of us have a responsibility. Even in your own community, that street where you stay is your responsibility. To make sure that you are part of preventing the scourge. If you hear the neighbor screaming, you don't say that's a private matter. We're not going to get involved. It must go to that level for us to prevent the scourge. So in closing, talk to us quickly about generation equality. We have young women in our Rise Labs. How do they become part of this? And where are we with generation equality?
So generation equality was our response to this 25 years of the Beijing Platform for Action, where after 25 years, we looked at it and we thought, we've done well in some areas. More girls are in school, less discriminatory laws across the world, less women are dying in childbirth. But oh my goodness, GBV persists. Women still don't have access to economic opportunity. The climate justice, women in farming and land and so on, we still have huge issues in the climate. Technology, women still, have less access to technology than men do. Sexual rights, and we talked about LGBTQI. The sexual and reproductive health and rights continue to be In fact, in some contexts, we're not allowed to mention the word rights. We can't even say rights in environments because, we can give women health, but we can't give them their sexual rights. So there's still a lot of work to do. And so if we continue at the current rate, Pina, we are 257 years away from gender equality. But 2030 is the year that we have all signed up as the world as the end of the SDGs, when gender equality is supposed to expire. Because we have to imagine that gender equality can expire. We cannot imagine that our whole lives, gender inequality is something we have to live with. No, actually, we should have gender equality. So generation equality was our call to action to the world, to say we have got to be those that make sure that there will be equality in our generation. My grandmother to my granddaughter will experience equality in this lifetime. And to do that, we have to, in Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka's words, we have to all jump up to the same tune at the same time. And what that has meant is that it's a multi-stakeholder platform and campaign. So previously, you find that with UN issues, it tended to be very intergovernmental. And so it's the governments doing it, which is why we've tended to say, what is the government doing about this? Has the government done this and that? And I'm just sharing with you now on GBV. This has got everything to do with every one of us.
Yes.
So what Generation Equality has been able to do is to pull together multi-stakeholders. Young women are at the center and front of ensuring that we're changing the game. And it's not about what we give to them. It's also about how they are contributing to changing the story. How are they also making sure that they are engaged and volunteering and participating wherever they can. It's about making sure that the private sector is on board, making sure that our community organizations, churches, etc., are on board. And in addition to governments. So we are proud that for the first time, Dr. Phumzile's legacy was that she was able to pull such powerhouses together at the Generation Equality Forum in Paris, that there are commitments of $40 billion towards gender equality. No UN agency has pulled this off, even for other sectors of work. So this is significant. It is a significant moment. In South Africa, we've established a multi-stakeholder platform where we've got every one of these issues have what we call the action coalitions. So we're going to take action to accelerate gender equality in these areas. We're going to accelerate the response to GBV. We're going to accelerate women's access to economic justice. We're going to accelerate women's action to technology and innovation. And within all of that, there is a youth journey in there that is actually trying to push in all of those areas. So we have a group that we call the Youth Journey Group. And I think what we need is to just link up Soul City with this group to make sure that your soul buddies can join them. And they're doing some powerful work there. And they're challenging us all the way. And it's really about like, for instance, when we had this civil unrest last 3-4 weeks ago in KZN and a little bit in Gauteng,
okay,
there was real dialogues and exchanges between young people using the Peace Pod, which is a peace podcast tool that the young people have pulled together along with the Ladies of Peace as part of the work that we do on women, peace and security. So this is an easy one to connect you to. The team there through our multi-stakeholder platform, and I think that would be a way to make sure that we're actually driving for gender equality. And it's about how do we accelerate these things? What are the radical things that we must do? What are the revolutionary things that we have to do to be able to change this game? Because we cannot walk at the same pace that we've been walking and hope. They say the definition of insanity is do the same thing and expect different results. So generation equality is about changing the game. And I think what was wonderful was to see heads of state standing side by side with young people, LGBTQI persons, civil society, women's feminist organizations standing on the table and having a conversation about the same thing. Usually the presidents speak to themselves and the governments have their own discussion and then we meet, So this is what this is about. So I welcome you to that group and will invite you to really join in with the Youth Journey Group. to accelerate action for gender equality?
We are definitely joining the Youth Journey Group, and we want to be part of the change. So thank you so much. I mean, there's so much we can talk about. We just need more time. And I believe this is the first of the many conversations and platforms where we will be engaging with leaders like yourself to give people the right information, because only when we have the right information do we know what steps to take in fighting and in being part of the solution. So what are your 5 key take-home messages to everyone who was listening to this conversation today?
Ooh, I should ask them. I think I said many things, and I remember the 5 key points. But anyway, just listen. Acceleration. Number 1, I started out by talking about this dream. You have a choice. You do have a choice. You have a choice whether you're going to wallow in whatever your situation is, or you're going to be able to actually reimagine a future for yourself. And reimagine the fact that there are women who have come from situations like yours or worse, who have been able to transform their future. And it started with a dream. So reimagine your own life. And if you need help with that, I'm sure Soul City and us would be happy to help you just, and maybe I would say to Soul City, let's have a dreams workshop where we have a chance for young people to reimagine what their future could be and what their world could be. I think the second point is that you have agency. You are not waiting to reach a particular place in order to take action. And the first thing to do with agency is to understand what your own circle of influence is. What is the circle around you that you can influence? What is the circle around you that you can impact? You don't need to look so far out there and imagine, oh my gosh, unless I get to New York, it's not going to happen. I mean, I didn't start there. You start with your own immediate circle of influence. The big thing with women that we are very strong at, but we only sometimes use it for, I don't know, weddings, funerals, parties, prom, and such likes, matric dance, we are mobilizers amongst ourselves. And so if you can form a little group, and we have a very powerful group called Young Women for Life, who are young women who, many of them are living with HIV, many of them are GBV survivors, and these young women decided to form this organization to change the trajectory of their lives. But they couldn't do it alone, each individually. They did it as a collective. And so Young Women for Life type of approach where you come together and they're like, let me put together 5 of us so that we can start working on a small problem. And the problem doesn't have to be a big one. Maybe the problem is to help one young person in your environment to, I don't know, to write a CV for a job, or to put money together to get her to a job interview. It doesn't have to be massive things, but really just starting, just do it, right? And the other one is to, you are the generation online. In our days, we used to use microfiche and other papers. We had to go to libraries to be able to get information. You can get information online. So make it your business to hunt for information around whatever that subject is, because the information is there, and information is power. And if you can find information about what you're doing, then you what it is that you want to do, then you are more likely able to move forward. And of course, the last one is to be able to know how to accelerate and to join this Generation Equality Forum, because we are trying to figure out what it would take to accelerate actions in those key areas that are left undone. I think the last one is to really find ways for you yourself, because, it starts with you. So what is it that you need to do to make sure that your own life counts? Your life must count. Your life, one of the things that is so, I'm saying the other day, I lost my mother 3 months ago. And one of the things that's painful when you lose a loved one is that the loved one goes by themselves. They go alone, and the whole time you've been thinking we're in this together. And sometimes we pull each other back thinking we're in this together. We're messing up together. We're doing nothing together. And then suddenly one of you steps out with that valid dream and you're left alone. So don't be left alone. Be that one that makes sure that we're pulling each other along as we do, that we're moving forward together.
Wow, I'm inspired. I hope everyone who was listening is as inspired as I am. And condolences, sorry for your loss. It's never easy losing a loved one, especially a mother. And in this Women's Month, we celebrate your mother, we celebrate you because she gave birth to a leader, to a formidable force. Salute to her and salute to you for the great work that you are doing and the UN Women and for everyone who's joined. Thank you so much. Continue engaging with us. We are going to give you information on everything that Anne shared, and I will make sure that where we have influence, our circle of influence at Soul City, we make an impact. In the Rise Clubs, in the Soul Buddies Club, civic education will be the norm. We are changing the narrative. We are tired of normalizing the abnormal. We want to normalize the normal things in this lifetime. So thank you very much, Anne. You are the change. You are the leader. Thank you. Salute to you and everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.